So good morning, everyone, and welcome to New Orleans. I'm Dr. Jeffrey Goldsmith, President of the American Society of Addiction Medicine. We're delighted to see all of you here for the ASAM 48th Annual Conference called Innovations in Addiction Medicine and Science. The next 3 days will be nothing ordinary in New Orleans. In fact, it will be amazing. Switching in microphones, okay. I'm continually astonished by the scope and breadth of this outstanding organization. The conference continues to grow in attendance and the number of educational offerings. We have a record-breaking registration again this year with nearly 2,100 attendees. And for the first time, there are attendees from all 50 states and DC, and a large number of international attendees representing 14 different countries. We are at an incredible point in history with our profession. Our specialty is officially recognized by organized medicine. Federal and state policymakers are giving priority our patients' needs through regulation and legislation. Policymakers are also focusing on the challenges we face in our practices to deliver quality care. And ASAM is the go-to organization for policymakers, the media, and other medical specialties, and the public. This conference is the nation's premier event for addiction medicine. We're thrilled to have distinguished guests here this morning. We'd like to take a moment to recognize these people. Would the former presidents of ASAM, as you see them on the screen, please stand. We thank you for your dedication and service to ASAM. Thank you. Would the ASAM Board of Directors, as you see on the screen, now stand? We thank you for your valuable contribution. ASAM's mission is closely aligned with other organizations who focus on addiction-related issues. I'm pleased to recognize that we have representatives from several of the organizations who have come to the conference. I ask the leaders and representatives of these organizations to please stand. The American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry, the American Board of Preventive Medicine, the Addiction Medicine Foundation, the International Society of Addiction Medicine, and the International Nurses Society on Addiction. Thank you for the efforts and organization. As they say, it takes a village to raise a child, so this is our village this morning. I would like now to start with our first speaker, Joseph Green. Joseph is the Youth Programs Coordinator at Split This Rock in Washington, D.C. Joseph is a spoken word artist, writer, and advocate. He is the co-founder and program director of Poetry Now, an after-school creative writing program working with students throughout the D.C. metropolitan area. Joseph has competed at the national level and has represented the DC Poetry Slam team, among others. He represented DC in 2011 at the individual Poetry Slam, ranking 16th in the world. He has over 10 years' experience as a professional spoken word artist and writer. Joseph, come on out. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. You could stay. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Cool. Good morning.
Good morning.
Outstanding. Has anyone read that yet? Because I thought it was clever. Okay, cool. Because what typically happens is the first slide starts the story, and then people are sitting there looking at what you're about to see now, which is something that you need to be prepared for. I am preparing you. That's my son. Right? Okay. He's not doing much there, but I appreciate you clapping for him. Remember this. As important as knowing what we are fighting against is knowing and never forgetting what we are fighting for. And we're going to come back to this. Aww, thank you. Life is short, but being alive is the longest thing you will ever do. Proceed accordingly. That has never gotten a laugh before, so thank you. So, we're going to get back to that in a second. Does anybody remember this? Yes, okay, cool. I'm not the only one. I was super excited when I found it on Google. So, today, we are going to have a quick conversation. I only have 20 minutes, so I don't have the time where I would typically tell the super witty joke right now. So I just need you to respond as if I did. A little funnier than that. Thank you. My name is Joseph Green. I am a spoken word artist, and if you don't know what a spoken word artist is, I talk poetry aloud. I am a father. I am an educator. I run a nonprofit. I started a nonprofit. I am a former junkie. I am a recovering alcoholic. And I am proud to say that I am in long-term recovery. And that is something that is very important to me. Yes. But we will also get back to that in a moment. I really dig what you guys do. I'm a poet. Let's try it again. I am inspired. I am indebted. I am moved to action by the work that you all do. So I would like to start, 3 minutes in, with a round of applause for yourselves, please. Okay, so in the script, it says C+, but in reality, it was like a D-. Your applaud for yourself was not that convicted. So I want to do an exercise before I do my whole talking poem thing real quick. Show of hands, how many people in here think, believe, or know that the work that they do has directly contributed to saving someone's life? Cool, hands down. Now, I need y'all to trust me for a moment. And I know when this thing happens at these type of things, people roll their eyes, but work with me. Close your eyes for a second, just 1 second. Close your eyes. Can you pull into your mind the face of someone whom your work has directly saved? See them. Think of their name. Now open your eyes. Now imagine this space filled with all of those people. And for all of those people, let's say 3 family members. So you have all of those people whose lives that you have directly helped save, and an entire room of their family members. That's a father, who gets to be reconnected with his family. That's a daughter that gets to grow up knowing her mother. That's a father, educator, poet, non-profiteer, who has directly worked with at least 10,000 young people in his career post. Do you see all those people around us? Can you feel their energy? Do you understand and completely grasp your worth? How important you have been to people like myself? I'm going to ask you one more time in a moment to give yourselves a round of applause. But this time I need you to keep in mind all of the victories. I need you to tear the roof off of this space to send all of this positive energy to those of us who couldn't be here today because of Atlanta. I need you to remember why you do this. So, here we go. Do not be cynical. The lights are completely on. I can see all of you. It is more fun to participate. Trust me. American Society of Addiction Medicine Conference, number 48, I believe. I need you right now to make some noise. This is for you. Thank you. Because that's technically what I'm here to do, to thank you. Through my life story, through my craft, I've put together a couple of poems that I like to share with people who do this work. Not only do I share with people who do this work, I share with young people all over the country. I've started several programs where poetry or art is used to destigmatize these issues that we've had such a hard time talking about. And so today, I'm going to share a poem. Thank you. Come on, people, we've been here. So, my father was an alcoholic. And as with most father, or not most, but a lot of father and son relationships, I decided that I wanted to be anything except like my father. I ran. And in running, never took the time to learn from his mistakes and ended up becoming my father. Which is to say that if you do not know where you come from, it's hard to know where you're going. And most times you will end up in those same traps. So this first poem I'm about to do is dedicated to my father and fathers and families and people that have had this type of destruction in their lives and have somehow found a way through. And for those who are still working through it. Show of hands, how many of you have ever seen a spoken word poem done live? Okay, cool. Hands down. If you've never seen this before, I'd just like to brace people for what's about to happen. All right? It's a poem that I say aloud with conviction. It's important to explain that to folks because a lot of times when people hear poetry, they shut off. They say, when are we going to get to, the real stuff? So this is the real stuff to me. This is my first poem, and I dedicate it, as I said, to families and to all of you out there who have helped keep families together. Life is short. In the hospital bed, I helped him turn so the medication could spread more evenly. His eyes welled and cracked like fortune cookies. Inside read, life is short, but being alive is the longest thing you will ever do. Proceed accordingly. If I'd attempted this homage to my father 10 years ago, probably would have consisted more of those intangibles that drove me away. Hate and blame, more than just symptoms of childhood angst, but the language I learned to speak in effort to explain how my father's absence from my formative years made me feel. You see, I once considered my father's DNA to be a cancer in me. Understanding the helix to be doubled, I never dreamed of losing myself completely, only half. A man now, I realized my thinking was the cancer. Forgiveness is medication. I am still waiting for it to spread evenly. Always with the wrong bottle in hand from birth, my father showed me the image of addict. Resembled something like a court jester juggling knives. One blade for family, one blade for work, one for the military that never treated him as equal, one for the father that died when he was 10, another for the mother that was never the same. All the while, spiraling down towards the greatest come to Jesus moment ever. 16-year-old son in the back seat as wife picks him up from jail after his second DUI. My father's been sober now for 30 years. My father was a drunk. I was a cokehead. They say parents want children to grow up, achieve feats greater than their own. I don't believe this is what they had in mind. I've spent years mortified of mirrors for having this image projected back on me. Sought a new likeness at the bottom of empty whiskey bottles and clear plastic baggies. Mainline hate and blame until I became so high, I had nowhere to go. Rock bottom in the sky, I landed in my father's arms. Through falling, I've come to realize that just as he did not, I did not ask for this predilection towards addiction, that hate and blame are just new ways to get high for those of us not willing to change, and that which took him 30 years only took me 3 years, because for the last 16 he has shown me what redemption looks like, what a life no longer lived in regret looks like. I refuse to be 20 years down the line, racing down Route 95, going 95, stopped by a cop, exclaiming out of the window of my car that, like most men, I never told my father I love him. Like most men, I never said, I forgive you, Pops, as I hope you have forgiven me. And though I realize neither side of this reflection will ever be perfect, I am no longer scared of mirrors, because life is short, but being alive is the longest thing you will ever do. Proceed accordingly. Thank you. 3 things. 1, whoever's water that is, my bad. Secondly, I've been waiting to do that poem in front of a room of doctors, and I didn't realize it until I got to the line that no one ever seems to understand, the double helix and losing myself and only half. And I was thinking to myself in the moment, they get it. And to be clear, that line came from maybe 5 minutes of watching a video on YouTube, not like a medical education. But I've always thought it was very clever. And the second thing is, the math in that poem is all wrong. And I realize, again, I have some pretty smart people in here, so I should probably say that out loud so that you understand that the poem is a true story. I just wrote it 10 years ago. I'm also a poet. I don't really do math very well. And so the 30 years and the 16 years, every time I get to it, I'm like, one day you're going to have to write that down and figure it out. Because right now it makes it seem like your dad is like 85 and he's like 70. And so anyway, that's a spoken word poem. And the power of art, the power of poetry to create connection, to start hard conversations, to help people find what's really going on inside. And at the very, very least, and what I think is the most important, it creates a sense of humanity. It's a story, and we all have stories. Every patient you've ever worked with has a story. You have a story. Your family has a story. All humans have a story that connects us. But we have so many systems in this world that try to categorize and push us into segments based off of the things that we've done wrong, based off the differences, based off where we're from, based off the decisions we've made, as opposed to understanding that on any given day, in any given life, depending on where you were born, depending on the things that you have going on inside of your head, any of us, but for the grace, could have been in the shoes of some of the people that we serve. And so that's why it's so important for me to go around and speak with people like you so that you know how important it is to do your work and that you never forget. Because there's a lot of paperwork, and there's funding, and there's keeping the doors open, and it's how many shifts can we put on, and this nurse is about to hit overtime, and this person doesn't have insurance, and so on and so on and so forth. And all of those things, they eat at our motivation. They eat at our inspiration. And so while I'm here merely doing 2 poems in 20 minutes, I encourage all of you to do this type of work on a regular basis. It's not about creating a world where no bad happens. It's about creating a system of protection around yourself and the things that you hold dear so that no matter what happens, you can always get up. You can always move forward. So I'm going to do one more poem for you all before I get off the stage. Is that okay? Yes, just one more poem. Thank you. Oh. The 12 of you, I appreciate your enthusiasm. That's always a weird question to ask. Like, who wants to hear one more poem? And then no one says anything. Oh, hey. You guys are really polite. It's a lovely bunch here. This next poem is the poem that got me into this work in the first place. He's in a sink. Say what?
How old were you then?
That's not me. That's my son. Oh, you say we look alike? Oh, got you. We do look alike. He is definitely mine. The power of narrative to heal and reveal purpose. A lot of the workshops that I do when I work individually or in small groups with people are about getting back to the root of the thing that got them here. And when I'm working with young people, trying to get them on a course to become whatever it is that they are destined to become, a lot of it has to do with finding the story that motivates them behind whatever subject they believe to be excited about. And a lot of times we tie it in and it's great and they move on. And sometimes we find that that's not really what's motivating them. And so when I stopped when I sought recovery, I was in a deep space of shame because I had left the people that I was dealing with at that time in what I knew were dire straits. I knew that they had gone further and were going further than I had. I knew that I had a family to go back to, a father who was already in recovery, and I had ways to make my life better. A year into my recovery, I get a phone call, and one of my best friends, one of the people that I'd done, coincidentally, the most drugs with, had committed suicide by overdose. And I had to go back. We had to bury him. And I had to face that. And as a writer, as an artist, I faced things by writing about them. And I hadn't written a poem in 2 years because I was scared of what would happen, what would open up, what I would have to face in that moment. And so I eventually wrote the poem, but I was scared to do it for people. It wasn't a matter of like if I was going to write it. It was, would I have the courage to share it? Because this is not something, applause and laughing aside, that I typically enjoy doing. Getting up in front of a room of strangers and say, hey, I have substance use disorder. And hey, I disappointed my family. And hey, I almost died 3 times. That's not something I enjoy doing. But I know its value. I know its worth. But it wasn't until I performed that poem for the first time, the poem I'm about to do for you now, and somebody came up to me and said, I've been through the exact same thing. And I never had the words to explain it until I heard your poem. I was feeling so alone. Thank you for sharing. And I say that for one reason. I encourage you to share your stories with each other while you're here. I know you're here to network. I know you're here to learn new things about your industry. I know you're here to see that person that you saw, 15 years ago and see if you guys still have a spark. I've only been going to these things for like 5 years, but I know in 10 years I'm going to find someone. I'll be like, I met you in Tulsa. And you gave me eyes across coffee, and I was just wondering. Take this opportunity to really connect, because your humanity needs to be served also. You cannot just be in a state of service. If we do not take care of ourselves, I'm sure you all have heard this before, but how are we going to take care of others? So here's one more. Yes, self-care. Clap for self-care. My last poem. Want to hear it? Here goes. Actually, I hate being on stage. Is this okay with y'all? In the back, you can still hear me, right? And I'm on the TV, right? Cool. Hey, everybody. What's up in front row? Dear John, talk ugly. The last time I saw you alive, I wish I would have talked ugly to you. Said, put the straw down. No, I don't want to take another line. I should be writing them. My friend, you are a composer of music and magic. Instruct your limbs to serve a purpose greater than self-indulgence. Do not be fooled into thinking your pain has sharper teeth than anyone else's. I had a chance, but said nothing because I was high. This is how I got started. A bottle of Jack and a mirror. Memories and scissors, dreams drenched in ether, sliced by razors, potential rolled like $20 bills, numbing the feeling on the tip of my tongue that I, or this tongue, should be serving a greater purpose. In the last-ditch attempt at self-assessment, I decided to look at my life through the eyes of loved ones, for they see everything, especially the ugly. From years of drug use, from lying with to lying to angels, friends I had forsaken, taking so much more than I had given, I had streamlined self-centeredness into a science. But there was a righteousness there, a willingness to craft these ills through alchemy and poetry into a seer stone. But honestly, how was I to speak ugly to you when I was yet to speak it to myself? In these nightmares of hindsight, there is no poetry. No alliterations to soften the blow. Some realities have no simile. Truth is like truth. How could I form my lips to call your suicide a tragedy when I left you alone in that room, kept company by narcotics and 1,000 ghosts draped in your disappointments? I can only imagine all the voices you heard, all but mine. Smear makeup onto disgust if you must. Trust the truth is seldom pretty, but she is always beautiful. It is in times like these that I need you to please talk ugly to me. My pain needs it. Too many times we caress sadness when it needs to be shaken, torn from its place of comfort, forced to grow wings to survive or die. Don't just tell me I can grow up and be whatever I want. Tell me that whatever I want is something I better be willing to achieve, that dreams will dissipate under the weight of addiction, and that there is a distinct difference between living like a rock star and actually being one. Sometimes, no matter how many poems you've written, you are just a cokehead and a poser. Fear not. We are all divinely flawed individuals, perfectly ugly. There's no point hiding behind pretty lies. We are the sum of the hideous scars that hold together the remainder of our pretty pieces. The last time I saw you alive, the last time I saw you alive, the last time I saw you alive, I wish I would have talked ugly to you. It would have been the most beautiful thing I never said. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Hang on one second.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Hey.
Okay, got to get to my script, but we have a plaque for you. I don't think the plaque does justice. I was at a meditation retreat a couple of weeks ago, and about day 5, your poems were right there. And our compassion prayer at these meditation retreats starts with yourself. So I love the way he began it. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. And it wasn't on my script, but I want you to know that tomorrow evening, Joseph will also be doing 8 to 9 o'clock, and you can find him here 8 o'clock tomorrow. Okay. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Patrice Harris, Chair of the Board of Trustees for the American Medical Association. Patrice Harris, MD, MA, is a psychiatrist from Atlanta, Georgia, poor Atlanta today, and has diverse experience as a private practicing physician, public health administrator, patient advocate, medical society lobbyist. She was elected to the American Medical Association Board of Trustees in June 2011. Dr. Harris has served on the board of the American Psychiatric Association and was an APA delegate to the AMA. She has also been a member of the governing council of the AMA Women's Physicians Congress, testified before and served on AMA reference committees, has served on AMA work groups on health information technology, SGR, and private contracting. Dr. Harris has held many leadership positions at the state level as well, including serving on the board and as president of the Georgia Psychiatric Physicians Association and on the Medical Association of Georgia's Council on Legislation, its Committee on Constitution and Bylaws, and its membership task force. She was also the founding president of the Georgia Psychiatry Political Action Committee. In 2001, Dr. Harris was selected Psychiatrist of the Year by the Georgia Psychiatric Physicians Association. In 2007, she was inducted into the West Virginia University Academy of Distinguished Alumni. Join me in welcoming Dr. Harris. She'll be speaking on the provider's role in combating the opioid crisis.
Thank you, and thank you for that kind introduction. Let me also say, perhaps I'll make up a little bit for Atlanta. Give us another chance. I know yesterday was rough, so sorry, Joseph. Also, let me say that was very inspiring. We in the medical community are paying particular attention to physician stress and burnout. And in your few words there, I am inspired and sort of figuring out a way that we can amplify your voice in that role. So thank you. Tough act to follow. It's a pleasure to be here at such an important time for healthcare and such a critical time in our national effort to reverse the opioid epidemic. But before I begin, I'd like to thank the leadership of the American Society of Addiction Medicine for inviting me here. Lots of friends that I've known for many years through my work both at the APA and at the AMA. And I want to thank you for your advocacy work on behalf of patients and for your continuing role on the AMA's task force to reduce opioid abuse. I also am going to take a risk this morning because when you name someone, you always sort of leave out someone important. But there's one person here that I have to name. You can actually blame her. She sparked my interest when I was a resident at Emory in addiction medicine and has remained a friend to me throughout my career. You know her well. She is a past president. So I'd like to thank Dr. Beth Howell. And Beth also knew that I didn't get a chance to get my Starbucks this morning, so she went to get me Starbucks. So thank you, Beth. As I've traveled to dozens of states and participating in meetings in Washington, D.C. and throughout this country, the discussion about the nation's opioid epidemic almost always begins with the sobering truth that opioid-related mortality is increasing. And depending on the venue, the finger is almost always pointed to physicians. To that, I always say yes. As physicians, we do bear our share of the responsibility for how we got here. But I always follow that by saying that we welcome that responsibility, we accept that responsibility for being a part of the solution to this epidemic and continuing to care for our patients. You know, this slide right here, unfortunately, when I first started doing this talk, it was with more than 78 people dying every day. And as you can see, this slide now has 91. And so we certainly have work to do, but in my opinion, blame should not be a part of the conversation. It's easy to point fingers, but it's another thing to roll up our sleeves and work for solutions. And that is our goal at the AMA and through the task force. Again, to work not only to drive the national conversation about this terrible national epidemic, but to provide direction on how we can achieve meaningful and measurable progress in this fight. And we have made much progress. When I first started to talk about this on panels, there was a law enforcement approach. It was, well, we need to lock up the folks who are using, and we need to lock up the doctors. Now, let me be clear. I am not talking about physicians who have abdicated their ethical and professional responsibility. That's a different category. As I think everyone in this room knows, most physicians are trying to do the best that they can with the resources that they have. So again, we have made some progress. The nation's opioid supply is decreasing. More physicians than ever are using their state's PDMP, those prescription drug monitoring programs. Access to life-saving drug naloxone has increased in nearly every state. And together, we've helped secure essential new federal funding to treat substance use disorders. Additionally, in 2016, ASAM led the effort to raise the federal cap on the number of patients that physicians can treat with buprenorphine to 275, and physicians have stepped up in a big way. Nearly 10,000 of our colleagues obtained their waiver to treat patients with buprenorphine. Now, this is an excellent sign of potential progress, and note I say potential, because we all know that there are many challenges to ensuring that physicians with the waiver actually treat patients with an opioid use disorder. Everyone in this room, I know, has a story of what those challenges are. When I go around the country, I hear the challenges. I get it. We've got the administrative barriers by health insurance companies. That's very frustrating and limit what we can do for our patients. We are still struggling, as someone said earlier, with the stigma. Joseph, you mentioned that. We are still struggling with the stigma regarding substance use disorders. And I have to say, sometimes it still is in our own medical community. I was at a talk recently, and someone asked about a person who had been rescued multiple times with naloxone, and they were frustrated and even raised the issue of, well, is there an endpoint to that? And Joseph, I think you mentioned this too, to which I said, of course not, because every life saved is an opportunity. And so no, there is no input. You know, we still have folks who believe that those who have substance use disorders have a moral failing or a character flaw. So yes, we are still battling those, and we know that that stigma continues to hurt our communities and our patients. So while I'm very proud, and you should be proud of the signs of progress we've made, I am mindful of the challenges ahead. Our work together has only just begun, and so I want to emphasize two things today. Number one, we're going to highlight some of the progress we've made, because sometimes in our work, we are nose to the grindstone. We don't sort of raise up and lift up the progress, so I'm going to do that today. And second, identify some important next steps that will make a big difference in our continuing fight against this public health crisis. And here is a spoiler alert. Probably this audience already knows this, but unless and until our nation fully commits to providing comprehensive pain care, I was talking to someone this morning, including non-opioid and non-pharmacologic care, and unless and until our nation fully commits to providing the resources necessary to treat patients with substance use disorders, unless and until those two things occur, we will continue to see staggering increases in opioid-related mortality. We will continue to see that number from 78 to 91. We will continue to see that increase unless we have that commitment. Now, I mentioned earlier how common it is for others to blame the medical profession. And again, we share some of that. Welcome, accept that responsibility. But there are some valid reasons, again, and not so valid reasons for this. And one thing that we continue to emphasize is that the need for physicians to take responsibility, again, for reversing the epidemic. And twice last year, we issued national calls to action. Hopefully many of you received that, strongly encouraging physicians to adopt more responsible prescribing practices to limit a patient's exposure to and then risk for addiction, but also the risk of opioids being used by someone else other than the person that received the prescription. The epidemic tells us that we need to be much more cautious in how we prescribe opioids, and I think physicians have heard that. The AMA is telling physicians that we need to avoid prescribing opioids unless the risks outweigh the benefits. And again, that was the power of the task force. These calls to action were shared by ASAM, thank you, and other organizations throughout the Federation of Medicine. You know, some of you are aware of the AMA that we have a tagline, and it said, "Together we are stronger." And to some people that sounds kind of hokey, but you know that is true. I learned that early in my medical career. I was a lobbyist or pretend lobbyist in Georgia. Beth remembers those days. And the battles that we fought on behalf of patients were won most often because the House of Medicine stood together. And so together we are stronger. And together we can reverse this epidemic. Now, while the task force began its efforts in 2015 and 2016 to urge changes to physicians' prescribing practices, physicians already were doing that on their own, and that is an untold story, so you should tell that story. The task force really just amplified the efforts, your efforts that were already going on to reverse this epidemic. So please don't accept the narrative that physicians were not doing anything about this early on. But from 2013 to 2015, there was a 10.6% decrease in opioid prescriptions nationwide. And that equates to about 25 million fewer prescriptions in 2015 when compared to 2013. So first of all, that tells me two things: that the task force was able to add its voice in the momentum of practicing physicians. And again, this is important because policymakers needed to know that we, again, recognize that need earlier in the process. And second, that physicians' actions to reduce the supply occurred before, and this is an important point, before state legislatures and others enacted laws that put forward policies to reduce the supply. So that's before a lot of these laws have been enacted. And one policy point I'll make here is that AMA and ASAM really work together to help ensure one key exception. You know, a lot of states are enacting laws that are limiting the number of pills and the number of days of pills and the highest dosage of pills. And I'm not saying those are not policies that should be considered, but they should be considered in the course of physician practices and medical boards and organizations like ASAM developing guidelines, as opposed to legislators sort of deciding what's an appropriate dose for a particular patient and how many days a patient should get. And I don't know how many of you saw in your state legislature that oftentimes they would lump everything together. They did just recently here in Georgia. Even medications that we use in medication-assisted treatment. So through the work of the AMA and ASAM, we were able to make sure that those medications were pulled from some of that legislation that I think well-intended, but certainly could have unintended consequences. So what does that say? That says to legislators, without our input, all products containing opioids are the same. And it was our state-level advocacy that ensured that your practices and your patients now don't have to, again, suffer those unintended consequences. Let me also highlight the PDMPs. An AMA survey confirmed for us that physicians credit PDMPs when, and I know some of you might groan at this because they don't all work well, but when they are fully functional and contain accurate information with helping them quickly access a patient's prescription history and determine whether or not they were receiving opioids or other medications. And so the task force does strongly encourage use of PDMPs. And we saw that as PDMPs improved, there was a 33% increase in registration nationally, and the number of queries to the systems increased by 40% to 85 million in 2015. And so we're gathering data for 2016, and we expect that number to be well over 100 million. So again, 3 points I'd like to make about this. First, just as the new mandates on prescribing, physicians' PDMP use increased before the mandates took place. So when your states are considering mandates, you can say, look, it's not that physicians are not interested in using PDMPs, is that they're interested in using PDMPs that work and give us real-time actionable data. And when that is the case, physicians will use PDMPs. And despite the increase in use, mortality rates rose. So again, this is about the evidence we all know. But what worries me is, again, well-intended policies are enacted. There's something that happens. Perhaps the number of prescriptions go down, PDMP use goes up, and a victory is declared. And we have to make sure, Joseph, I think, was talking about truth. We have to make sure that these data points are necessary but not sufficient. Sorry, I'm speaking away from the mic. It is necessary, perhaps, for the number of prescriptions to go down, but what does that mean? What's behind that? And are patients with pain now being undertreated? And we know that there are certain communities, particularly communities of color, who are undertreated for pain because of implicit bias. So again, it's not enough just to declare a victory because there are fewer prescriptions. We have to really get to what we all want, and that is reduced mortality. And so it's important to get behind those numbers. PDMPs are not a panacea. I think you'll have some legislators say, well, if we just get a PDMP, everything will be all right. PDMPs don't treat patients, right? And so PDMPs are great tools when they are, as again I said, user-friendly and have real-time information. So again, I know that many of you use your PDMPs in various ways to help manage your patients, but the key is you use PDMPs to help manage your patient. PDMPs don't treat patients. But again, this is where we need your help. We need physician leaders on the front lines of this epidemic to take the lead in developing best practices to get the most from our available tools. It is you who will be working together as a profession, as a society, and with your state legislators to make sure that PDMPs work and they get to a solution. Again, policymakers are already telling us what to do, but wouldn't we rather learn from one another? Now, there's been a steady growth in the number of physicians certified to treat substance use disorders. As I said, again, 80% growth between 2012 and 2016, 10,000 new data waivers. But again, and you know this statistic better than most, still less than 20% of patients are receiving treatment. And so here's the next question we have to wrangle with. How can we get folks who are waivered for 275 up to 275? How can we get doctors who aren't waivered to get waivered? And then how can we get that treatment out to the population? You know, I heard from some of my primary care colleagues who want to help but are a little reluctant to do this. And so I think it is up to professional societies to help those primary care physicians who want to do this work with support, perhaps telemedicine, perhaps serving as a consulting physician, addiction medicine professional would help. So I think it's up to us in the room to figure out how to make sure that we get the treatment to some. I know there was some resistance to increasing that waiver, and one of the arguments was, well, the doctors that are currently waivered aren't treating folks. And so we always have to keep that in mind as folks, as we continue to move on regarding making sure that there is adequate treatment. So here are a few areas where I think we have some opportunities. First, enforce existing laws. Quick show of hands. Who here in the room thinks that their state is already enforcing existing state and federal laws regards to parity regarding mental health and substance use disorders? Okay, got one. I was going to say not many, and then I was able to say not one, but I have one. So these laws, as you know, exist in all states, and so it's up to us, the leaders in this room, to demand that our states enforce them. The first call I ask you to make when you return home is to your state medical society, to ask them, to ask officials in the state, work with them to enforce these laws that hold so much hope for so many who are battling substance use disorders. Departments of insurance have told the AMA that they don't receive any patient complaints. Yeah, that's what they've told the AMA. They don't receive the complaints, and without information, they assume there is no problem. So ASAM has good tools to help you make sure these policymakers hear from you. Use them, please. Second, build new partnerships. We have to move beyond our traditional allies. I always say not the usual suspects. We need more coalitions at the state level. State attorneys general have been supportive of increasing access to care, but we can and must strengthen these relationships. Hopefully you saw the AMA applauded the New York Attorney General in February when he was able to work out an agreement with mega insurers Anthem and Cigna to end their policies of prior authorization for medication-assisted treatment in New York and across the nation. Aetna agreed to end prior authorization for MAP voluntarily, but we need to ensure that Anthem and Cigna are following the letter of that agreement, and we need to be sure that Aetna is doing what it promised to do as well. The health insurance companies said that they remember this, they reserved the right to prior auth certain dosage and quantity limits that were outside the boundaries of accepted best practices. And that's fine, but it should be the exception and not the rule. So if either of these companies require prior auth for you when prescribing MAT, send that experience to ASAM staff, send it to me, send it to your state medical society, send it to your state AG. Get involved. The AMA will continue to urge other AGs to get involved, and we will continue to urge, I use that term urge, we had some other terms, we will continue to urge the insurers to do the right thing. And if Anthem and Cigna can do this, why not all Blue Cross plans? Why not United Healthcare? Why not every health insurance company? So finally, I want to thank you on a colleague-to-colleague level for doing what you do. As a child psychiatrist, I know how complex it is to treat patients with multiple comorbidities. I know the challenges of treating chronic diseases and the mental health care needs that simply don't have easy answers. This is not easy work. There are no easy victories. But I know that our training teaches us to go towards emergencies, to accept the challenge and responsibility that comes with the oaths that we took so many years ago, and some maybe not so many years ago. To reverse the nation's opioid epidemic, it will take the combined efforts of everyone in this room and an army of allies to open more doors of recovery for more of our patients. 2 in 10 can get treatment when they need it. Unacceptable. They are depending on us to get this right and to make every opportunity count. So thank you very much for your time this morning. It was a pleasure to be here.
You're doing great. This plaque is for Dr. Harris. We want to appreciate all her efforts at the AMA and to thank her for her talk here today. Thank you. Okay, well, we've already had a lot, but one more. This is wonderful. Actually, 2 more. Okay, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Barbara Mason, who will be giving the 2017 R. Brinkley Smithers Distinguished Scientist Award winning lecture. Barbara Mason, PhD, is the director of the Pearson Center for Alcoholism and Addiction Research at the Scripps Research Institute. The focus of the research program in Dr. Mason's Laboratory of Clinical Psychopharmacology is the clinical evaluation of potential medications for protracted abstinence and relapse prevention in alcohol dependence and related disorders such as nicotine and cannabis dependence. Future research in Dr. Mason's laboratory will include human studies to rapidly screen potential relapse prevention medications, and clinical trials to evaluate the safety and efficacy of novel medications to prevent relapse and reduce symptoms of protracted abstinence in outpatients with alcohol dependence or cannabis dependence. We have to get into DSM-5, I apologize. Dr. Mason was awarded the Weill Cornell Alumni Award in 2009 and served as a member of the National Institutes of Health National Advisory Council on Drug Abuse from 2012 to 2014. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mason as she presents her lecture titled Shedding New Light on an Old Problem, Novel Treatments for Alcohol Use Disorder.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to ASAM for the Art Brinkley Smithers Award. It actually has a great deal of personal meaning to me because my first training in alcoholism and addiction was at the Smithers Center in New York City at the Roosevelt Hospital under Ann Geller, a former president of ASAM, marvelous role model, and the first person who actually introduced me to clinical research. And so you can see how it feels coming full circle today for me. And you're my constituents. You're who I do my work for, to try to provide new tools in the toolbox for treating a very pervasive and undertreated disorder. When I first worked at Smithers, we only had antabuse. That was the only tool in the toolbox for alcoholism, in addition to all the work that was done at the 28-day inpatient rehab. But unfortunately, because of cutbacks in insurance, we rarely have access to 28 days of inpatient rehab. And a lot of alcoholism treatment is done on an outpatient basis, which means that relapse prevention medications become more important as tools. So I was very excited when naltrexone came along, approved originally in 1984 for opiate addiction, and then in 94 for alcohol dependence, and more recently in its injectable form in 2006. And on the other side of the pond in Europe, cambrosate was being developed in the 80s and approved in the US in 2004. But when you think about when naltrexone and cambrosate were developed, that was in the 80s, which means that it's been decades since a new molecular entity has come forward to help us in assisting people who complete alcohol withdrawal and then have this vulnerability to return to drinking. It's estimated that about 80% drink in the year following treatment for alcohol use disorder. And yet, prescriptions for any one of these 3 FDA-approved treatments are very underutilized. A nationwide pharmacy survey showed that fewer than 9% of afflicted Americans have ever received a prescription for one of these medications, and yet their effect sizes are about comparable to those found in meta-analysis, for example, conducted by Michael Thays, of the effect of antidepressants on remission rates in major depressive disorders. Yet everybody gets antidepressants for depression. And so there's this disconnect. And it's a very important objective of the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism to develop medications with stronger effect sizes, better tolerability, lower risks, and that will be more widely utilized both by patients and treatment providers. Takes 2. So this is adapted from George Koob's work on the neurobiology of alcohol dependence and addiction. People tend to think of the rewarding effects of alcohol and other drugs of abuse. And of course, they're important in beginning to get people to drink to excess, and our medications, naltrexone reduces the risk of heavy drinking and abuse, also affects the binge intoxication phase. But after acute withdrawal, there's this period that we call protracted abstinence, where negative affective states like anxiety, irritability, dysphoria emerge, sleep disturbances, urges to use, and then boom, you're right back to the binge intoxication phase. And what George and his colleagues identified was just as important as the rewarding properties of drugs are the effect of not using drugs in the addicted brain, which activates stress systems in the brain in response to discontinuation. And it's especially this area called the extended amygdala that drives the withdrawal negative affect state, the state that is associated with the anxiety, dysphoria, irritability, sleep disturbance, etc. And when these stress systems become activated, they release neuropeptides that George calls the misery neuropeptides. Corticotropin releasing factor is extremely important. It's also known by its initial CRF. Dynorphin, vasopressin, orexin, substance P, glucocorticoids. All of these substances being released in this piece of the brain drive the risk vulnerability to drinking relapse and early abstinence. But to someone with my proclivities of clinical research, each one of these identified neuropeptides offer an opportunity for medication development. And I'm talking about medications that act to return balance, or what we call homeostasis in the brain, between these overactivated stress systems and the systems, the natural systems that calm the brain down. And so that is my mission, to try to identify medications that can return the brain to homeostasis and support recovery. And George and I developed this grant together in 99, I think it was, 99, to develop parallel animal and human models to screen potential medications to treat this phase of early recovery and bring the brain back into homeostasis. So my human laboratory model of protracted abstinence involves the internal cues of negative affective states combined with the external risk factor, which is exposure to your favorite alcoholic beverage where you can smell it and see it but can't drink it, and measure responsivity to those cues in people who are on the study drug or placebo. And of course, we also measure the safety and make sure it doesn't have abuse potential, because one thing that I learned at the Smithers Center was you do not want people to come into treatment addicted to one substance and leave addicted to two. So that's something we always watch out for. So these are our mood induction methods. We have a big screen that has like negative images that can be associated with intoxication, like domestic violence or DUIs or disinhibiting romantic encounters, sporting events, or neutral images like books or mushrooms. And then they actually have their favorite beverage under their nose or control of spring water. So everybody gets all 6 conditions, each affective state paired with each beverage state. And what we found in studying acamprosate, which was the only drug that acts in the protracted abstinence phase, is that we needed about 40 subjects, 20 on active, 20 on placebo, to get a difference in outcome. And what's important is that how people behave, how people with active alcohol use disorder respond to drug or placebo in this human lab model is predictive of how they'll respond to that drug in clinical trials, both in terms of how they behaved in the lab model with the Kemper-Sate naltrexone relative to the meta-analysis results, how they responded to the lab model relative to clinical trial results with gabapentin, pregabalin, or duloxetine. And this was true for both positive and negative results in the case of duloxetine. So one drug I want to call your attention to is gabapentin. It's available for human study because it's FDA approved for other indications, and this is something that we really have to bring our attention to because of the very limited pharmaceutical company pipeline. We have to look around and think, okay, so we have this hypothesis, we have these neuropeptides identified, we want to see what we can do to reduce the stress activation in the brain without inducing addiction. So what's out there? What can we use? What can we repurpose? And at NIH, repurposing existing available drugs for big unmet medical needs is an important call to action. So it's available. It modulates GABAergic activity. It is not a GABA agonist, which would have addictive potential. And it's hypothesized to restore homeostasis in brain stress systems, dysregulated independence and withdrawal. But it's also been used off-label to treat symptoms associated with protracted withdrawal and risk of relapse, such as dysphoria, anxiety, and insomnia. And it's not metabolized in the liver, which is a very important pharmacokinetic advantage for alcoholics because the liver is often the organ first and most damaged by chronic heavy alcohol use. So we randomized people to either 1,200 milligrams of gabapentin or placebo for a week, and then did our thing with the lab study and found that gabapentin relative to placebo reduced the strength of their urge to drink, the impulse to drink, the feelings of loss of control over the impulse to drink. And we also found that it improved many dimensions of sleep, including how long it took a person to fall asleep. The people on gabapentin had no complaints about sleep quality relative to placebo, and they had fewer problems with sleep efficiency, meaning they were actually sleeping while they were lying in bed instead of rolling around. So we had less craving, better sleep, good safety and tolerability, no evidence of abuse potential, and decided that we should conduct a randomized controlled trial in treatment seekers. And our hypothesis is that gabapentin would have efficacy for the treatment of alcohol dependence, either acting directly on drinking behavior or acting on symptoms of protracted withdrawal that may modulate drinking behavior, such as the disturbances in mood and sleep and craving. And so we randomized 150 subjects to either placebo or the lowest FDA-approved dose of gabapentin or the highest FDA-approved dose of gabapentin for 12 weeks. They also received abstinence-oriented counseling individually on a weekly basis, and then also completed post-treatment follow-up 3 months off drug, because one thing that I often saw is after 28 days of inpatient treatment, people would go back to their communities and relapse. In this case, these are all outpatients. They're going through treatment in their communities, and then we follow them off drug for another 3 months in their communities to see if the effects of treatment sustain them through this period. And so what we found was that the highest dose of gabapentin, 1,800 milligrams, had a considerable benefit over placebo in terms of the rate of people being completely abstinent over the 12-week study. That was a number needed to treat of 8 for the 1800 relative to placebo. And for no heavy drinking, we also got a significant effect of 1800 relative to placebo with a number needed to treat of 5 for no episodes of heavy drinking over the 12-week treatment period. And the FDA, by the way, is most interested in no heavy drinking as an outcome for a medication. They believe that complete abstinence, not having a single drink, although we might find that to be desirable, that's a lot to ask of a medication. And there's more to treatment than a medication. And everybody needs to know that. We're not talking silver bullets here. We're talking a tool in the toolbox. So this condition was also met in terms of the drug having an effect on no heavy drinking. And also, consistent with our hypothesis, if you remember that 1,800 milligrams is the purple, in terms of the Beck depression inventory, you had less dysphoria, less craving, and less sleep disturbance. And what's important also with gabapentin in alcohol dependence samples, and this has been true and replicated over multiple samples at this point, is that in the pain and epilepsy trials that were conducted for FDA approval, somnolence was one of the, daytime drowsiness was one of the most common sleep effects. That's not been found. It's actually the reverse has been found because our patients come into treatment with sleep disturbances that become normalized so that they actually have fewer complaints of daytime dysfunction and drowsiness with gabapentin relative to placebo, though of course you should always advise patients to become familiar with the drug and its effects on their brain before driving or operating heavy equipment. So at those 24 weeks post-treatment, the effects on drinking were sustained, which suggests that we had treated people long enough to return the stress systems to a state of homeostasis where they could sustain the effects of medication. Now, I just want to quickly tell you about a drug that acts in a similar pathway as a way of my bringing some further validity to this approach of focusing on the stress system as a treatment opportunity in early recovery. So mifepristone is another repurposed drug. It's approved for use in Cushing's patients. But we know that heavy alcohol use and withdrawal is associated with abnormal hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activity and glucocorticoid receptor feedback, particularly sensitization of corticotropin releasing factor in the extended amygdala, which is that key brain area that drives the negative affect in early abstinence. Mifepristone is a mixed progesterone glucocorticoid receptor antagonist, and we thought clinically administering mifepristone and alcoholics following acute withdrawal may normalize the HPA axis dysregulation and thereby protect against relapse during protracted withdrawal. It kind of recalibrates the HPA axis, and most of this work is done in 4 days. We use 7 days just to make sure we don't miss anybody, but there's no advantage to treatment beyond 7 days. So this is quite a novel use of medication, not lifelong daily medication. So we hypothesized that mifepristone relative to placebo will show proof of concept efficacy in non-treatment seeking outpatients by significantly decreasing craving in response to those alcohol cues in the human laboratory model, and also how much they drank under natural conditions during 1 week of treatment and 1 week of post-treatment follow-up. Remember, this is a human laboratory study. This is not the full-fledged clinical trial. And so we randomized people to 600 milligrams of mifepristone or matched placebo for a week. and everybody has to be abstinent for 3 days before testing. And we can prove that they were with alcohol glucuronide testing of their urine. So we know that they were abstinent and that the stress systems were beginning to get activated. So what we have is, as with gabapentin, a reduction in the strength of the urge to drink, in the intention to drink now, if they could, reduction in feelings of loss of control over the impulse, very similar profile to gabapentin on the lab study. And then looking at the naturalistic measures of drinking off drug, you can see that the mifepristone drinking levels continue to go down while the placebo drinking levels start to go up. So the reductions in craving, drinking, and also in liver function test values relative to placebo suggests mifepristone has therapeutic potential for treating alcohol dependence. It was well tolerated. There were no concerns about safety, abuse potential, noncompliance, or rebound when the drug was discontinued. And these findings support the predictive validity of preclinical studies showing glucocorticoid antagonism reduces reinstatement of ethanol seeking and intake, and lend support to the role of drugs that target abstinence-related dysregulation and brain stress systems for the treatment of alcohol dependence. So just to summarize, in the human laboratory model that I talked to you about, it uses mood induction and in vivo alcohol cues. It reliably causes craving in abstinent alcoholics. We only use non-treatment seekers. Decreased drinking is predicted by decreased alcohol-induced craving in the human laboratory model, so we don't have to do the big clinical trials to get a sense of whether a drug is going to be helpful or not. It did demonstrate predictive validity for drinking outcomes in clinical trials of acamprosate, naltrexone, gabapentin, pregabalin, and duloxetine, and offers a reliable method for proof of concept testing of drugs to treat relapse risk and protracted abstinence and alcohol dependence. And I want to acknowledge that all the work that I presented and the other work that I've done, which includes the original studies of nalmefene, which is now approved in the European Union, and just so many studies that have contributed to tools in the toolbox, have all been funded by the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And I want to point out that it's not just the research, which I share with you, but all the people who actually get treated and the ones who don't qualify receive a referral for treatment in the community on a sliding fee. So it's like a spreading pool of good when NIH funds clinical research. So I just wanted to give that shout out to them for their support and how important it is that funding remains intact for NIH. Go team. Thank you.
For Dr. Mason, I want to present her with the R. Brinkley Smithers Distinguished Scientist Award. It's quite something to get this award. We're very pleased to be able to offer it for highly meritorious contributions in advancing the scientific understanding of alcoholism, its prevention and treatment. Thank you so much. We're going to shift gears now. Brings us to the fireside chat. Unfortunately, inclement weather prevented the Surgeon General from joining us in New Orleans. Joining me on stage is Kelly Clark, MD, MBA, President-elect of ASAM, and joining us via Skype is Vice Admiral Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General of the United States.
Well, we're very pleased to have the Surgeon General here today, and we're very honored to have you, Vice Admiral, joining us today. Can you hear me all right? Vice Admiral, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Excellent. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
We're very honored to have you join us today for the 48th Annual ASAM Conference, and particularly pleased to have this informal fireside chat format here today. We're sorry that you couldn't get in due to Atlanta. We've all been bashing on Atlanta and the weather today and the problems with transportation, but despite your inability to be here physically, we're very pleased that you can join us. I'll be asking you a series of questions that are of interest to our membership and me. And I'd like to start off by asking, just seeing you in the photo there, what is that uniform you're wearing and what does that all signify?
Well, first of all, let me say how glad I am to be able to join you. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but we did in fact have a lot of storms here in DC yesterday. We actually checked airports within a 150-mile radius of DC in hopes that we could get out of here, but unfortunately the weather gods were not in our favor yesterday. But I'm glad to be able to join you here by Skype at least. And the uniform that I'm wearing is actually the uniform of the United States Public Health Service Commissioned Corps. Those of you who may have either served in the military or have friends who have may look at this uniform and recognize that it's very similar to the Navy uniform. But the Public Health Service Commissioned Corps is a service that's over a century old, and for that many years it has worked hard to protect the public health of the country. We have 6,600 uniformed officers across a variety of health disciplines, from doctors and nurses to pharmacists and physical therapists, who in their day jobs each and every day help to advance public health for communities, and who also, during times of emergency, deploy to address Zika, Ebola, as they did a couple of years ago, and natural and man-made disasters. So it gives me great pride to wear this uniform because it reminds me of the sacrifice and the sense of mission that our officers bring to their work each and every day.
Thank you for that. You know, I often see members of the Service Corps at ASAM meetings, and I would actually like to take the moment to invite everyone, as you see our colleagues who are really working in this kind of service, to thank them for their service when you see them. And if we could, I see some here right now, just take a brief moment and applaud them.
Thank you so much for recognizing our officers. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. We appreciate their service on behalf of the country. You've been traveling pretty extensively around the country talking about the addictive disease. You've been talking to physicians and other clinicians. I'm wondering, as you've been talking to folks, what is it that makes you most optimistic about our capacity as a country and the willingness of physicians and other clinicians to treat addictive disease?
Well, the truth is, the people who are in the room right now listening to this talk are among those who make me most optimistic, because what I have found as I have traveled to urban and rural areas, across the country, is that we have clinicians and public health leaders who are often operating in very austere circumstances without a lot of resources, with a lot of extra time in their schedule, but who want to be a part of the solution, who recognize that addiction is a crisis that is tearing communities apart everywhere in America, and that something has to be done, and they want to step up and be a part of that solution. And that's really what gives me the most hope. I also have found that there are community members, even outside the public health and medical fields, who have been directly impacted by this crisis. And one of the things that really struck me the most when I became Surgeon General and began traveling around the country and hearing from people about what they needed and what they hoped from their Surgeon General was I was really struck by how broad the impact has been of the addiction crisis. People have either directly or indirectly been impacted in some way. But it's not always easy to know that because of the unfortunate negative attitudes that surround addiction that prevent people from talking about the illness and talking about how their families may be impacted. I had actually one family member who told me after she lost her son tragically to an opiate overdose, she said that previously when her family had undergone hardship, when someone had passed away or one of their family members had lost their job, people would line up with meals that they would offer the family and gift cards that they would leave at the doorstep. But when her son passed away, there was an eerie silence. People didn't know what to say. They weren't sure whether they should publicly acknowledge it because they thought the family might be embarrassed. And so she felt shockingly isolated at a time when she really needed people. But despite that, I do find that there are families, especially those who have been most painfully impacted by this crisis, who are stepping up to help others to ensure that other families don't sustain the same pain that they did. And that gives me an incredible sense of optimism and hope that we can ultimately address addiction in America.
Thank you. Yes, I know that the passion in this room and really from everyone who is involved in treating addictive disease, preventing addictive disease, educating about addictive disease is extraordinary. And thank you for recognizing that as well. As you've been on your travels, what is it that causes you the most concern or seems like the biggest challenge that you see as the biggest barrier for more clinicians stepping up and offering treatment for addictive disease?
Well, when it comes to clinicians in particular, I think our greatest asset with clinicians is that their hearts are in the right place. Nearly every clinician that I meet on the road entered the healthcare field because they want to relieve suffering. And for many of them, that ideal is still there. It may be buried under mounds of bureaucracy and under a cynicism that may have developed because of challenges that they've encountered in the healthcare system. But deep down, that idealism is still there. So that is our greatest asset. But what we're asking clinicians to do, not just with addiction, but often with other illnesses, is we're often asking them to do things that they weren't trained to do. We're asking them to connect patients with treatment in a system that often doesn't have the resources to make that treatment available, whether that's a lack of health insurance coverage that some of our patients face, or whether that's a lack of treatment centers for substance use disorders, which we unfortunately encounter in many communities across America. And what this contributes to is a dangerous lack of self-efficacy among clinicians. I remember very clearly when I was practicing medicine in Boston before coming down to DC to serve as Surgeon General, that the patient care was really one of the crown jewels of my day-to-day experience. I enjoyed it so much. I learned so much from my patients. I enjoyed both the very humanitarian but also intellectual exercise of practicing medicine. But there were times where I felt burned out. And what was the greatest contributor I found to my burnout was not just the hours, but more so it was being in situations where I felt like I wasn't able to help my patient, where I knew what they needed but didn't know how to get it to them. And that contributed to a sense of lack of self-efficacy that is a major contributor to burnout for clinicians all across America. So if we want clinicians to be able to be an effective part of the solution, we have to equip them across the board with the right skills to be able to screen for, diagnose, and ultimately treat people with substance use disorders. We need to make sure that we are creating a healthcare system where people actually have healthcare coverage. And while we've made a lot of strides there in the last few years, we still have millions of people in our country who lack health insurance coverage. And we need to make sure that treatment is widely available. We have a massive treatment gap right now with more than 1 million people with opioid use disorder who need treatment but aren't getting it. We have to close that gap. So ultimately, I believe that clinicians are going to be an extraordinary resource for us. Many of them already have been. But if we really want to utilize the full potential of our clinical specialists around the country and our primary care doctors, we need to make sure that we are providing the training and building a system that works for patients and for their clinicians.
Thank you. Thank you. You spoke just a moment ago about the need for treatment for opioid addiction, and certainly we are hearing a lot of that in the media and from politicians. Your report very importantly spoke to the morbidity and the mortality that's related to the use of alcohol. And with the emphasis on the opioid epidemic right now, and a rightful emphasis, but how do you think that we as clinicians can help policymakers, help the media, help people understand better dangers of the harms of alcohol use and the need for more and better treatment for alcohol use disorders as well as opioid use disorders?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm so glad you asked that. There's a reason that our report was not the Surgeon General's report on opioids alone, but it was the Surgeon General's report on alcohol, drugs, and health. And what we recognized in this report is that there are a variety of substances that we need to be concerned about. With the report, we really had three big goals. One was to help the public understand the scope of the addiction crisis, helping people recognize that when you put alcohol and various drugs together and look at the collective impact, that these cost our country $442 billion a year. That's a billion with a B. And that's in healthcare costs, lost productivity costs, and criminal justice system costs. And what most people don't realize is that nearly 200 billion of those costs actually come from alcohol-related illness. And so alcohol continues to be a major problem for us. And part of what we need to do is we need to continue screening for alcohol use disorders in our clinical settings. But we also need our clinicians increasingly to engage with community organizations, groups like the YMCA, faith-based organizations, and others that want to play a role in health. And we need to help them understand that alcohol continues to be a problem that we have to screen for, that we have to talk about, and one where we need to identify people who need help and then connect them to help. Right now we are seeing the opioid epidemic in the headlines a lot, and for good reason. But it's absolutely important that we not forget that the universe of substance use disorders includes more than opioids alone. And part of our responsibility of making sure the country doesn't forget about that does fall to our clinicians. And let me actually say another word about the role of clinicians here and about the public more broadly. Many people have recognized that this report that we issued on alcohol, drugs, and health was the first ever Surgeon General's report on the topic of addiction. We issued it because this crisis has become one that we can no longer ignore as a country, and we issued it because we wanted to spur action in our country and call the nation to action to address this public health crisis. But a report in and of itself does not solve problems. A report is a catalyst, and Surgeon General's reports in the past have actually served to kick off activity around the country that has helped to address major public health issues. In 1964, for example, my predecessor, Luther Terry, issued a seminal report on tobacco. And that report helped kick off a half-century's worth of work that helped reduce smoking rates from 42%, where they were in 1964, to closer to 15 to 16% where they are today. Still a lot of work to do, but a lot of progress made. If we are going to see progress on the front of addiction, we will need a response to this report and a response to this epidemic, more importantly, that's equally robust. That means that we need clinicians and community members to be helping to educate folks around the country about the importance of addressing addiction. That means that we also need our clinicians in particular to help mobilize a culture shift in how we talk about and think about addiction, a shift that focuses on moving us away from looking at addiction as a moral failing or a character flaw, and helping people understand that this is in fact a chronic illness that deserves the same care and compassion and urgency that other chronic illnesses like heart disease or cancer or diabetes do. And we'll also need our clinicians to use their voices to speak to policymakers, to call for the changes that we need. We have seen a lot of progress in the last few years, and one of the things that makes me optimistic is that addressing addiction really has been, especially in recent years, a bipartisan issue. But our lawmakers often need to hear from people who are on their front lines, people who have dedicated their lives to helping patients and making sure they can get what they need. Because our lawmakers aren't always on their front lines right there in our clinics and our hospitals. So they need you to help them understand what's working and what's not, where we need to lean in with more investment. And I'll tell you that right now, I don't feel that our policymakers hear often enough from people who are on the front lines. So my hope is that all of those who are listening today and our other health professionals across the country will recognize that beyond what you're able to do in your clinics and hospitals and departments of public health, your voice and your ability to use that voice with policymakers and with community leaders to both engage and shape policy, but also to shape the community response, that voice could not be more important now than ever before.
Thank you. We appreciate that call to action for our members. We heard a call to action earlier from Dr. Harris of the AMA, and you are exactly mimicking and saying what she said there. The reverberation is very loud for us to make our voices heard. You mentioned, as we've talked about alcohol, when we talked about opioids, I had a reporter ask me the other day if cannabis was associated with any terrible health conditions like cancer. And I said, well, you know, alcohol is, and tobacco is, so if we assume marijuana is just as safe, as you've been traveling, as you've heard from clinicians and many members of the public, there is an increasing conception that cannabis is harmless or perhaps even beneficial, although we know that there are health harms associated with cannabis. How do you see the movement toward legalizing and this increasing trend? How do you see this impacting our ability to prevent and to treat addictive disease?
Well, it's a great question, and marijuana actually comes up as a topic everywhere I go, and for the exact reasons that you stated, because many states have moved forward with legislation to legalize it either for medical use or recreational use or both. Here's my concern. My concern is that we are not letting science drive our policymaking right now when it comes to marijuana. I believe that with marijuana and with any substance, really it should be science and not opinion that drive our decisions and the laws that we make. And unfortunately, there are many people who have misconceptions about marijuana. Number one, I have found that folks across the country routinely underestimate the harmful impact of marijuana. There are many people who don't think that it's addictive at all. And we know that that is in fact not the case, that marijuana is addictive, and it's particularly addictive if it's used early in life. But what I also find is that there are misconceptions about the therapeutic effects of marijuana, and particularly about the depth of evidence that we have or don't have. So there are many people I encounter who feel that it's been proven definitively by science that smoking marijuana can cure a variety of medical conditions. And while there has been research on the components of marijuana and their therapeutic effect on a variety of symptoms, what we don't have evidence of is that smoking marijuana is both safe and effective for treating medical illnesses. We certainly don't have the degree of evidence that we would need to approve this, for example, through an FDA process yet. And I believe that we should subject marijuana to the same standards that we would any other substance that we seek to use for therapeutic purposes. So that's my concern about marijuana. And the real question is, how are we going to close this gap between the rhetoric and reality when it comes to marijuana? And I think that clinicians need to be an important voice in helping to educate communities and policymakers about this. Right now, we live at a time where people's trust in public institutions is not nearly as high as we want it to be. We live in a time where people are often cynical, about authority figures, and where they're not sure where to look for truth. I remember years ago when the internet was first in its early stages, that people said that once the web was universally accessible, that it would be impossible for people to lie anymore, because you'd be able to just look it up on the internet and verify whether it was true or not. And I think we all know that didn't quite work out that way. But because of that, unfortunately, we're in a situation where people are routinely getting information across the spectrum from the internet and in the media, and they're not quite sure what to believe. And so it falls to clinicians and to other trusted voices to respond and to fill in that gap and to be a source of truth. And at a time where trust, as I mentioned, is not as high as we want it to be, clinicians still retain a very high degree of trust from the American public. Nurses are really top of the food chain when it comes to who's really trusted the most. Doctors are not too far behind. Yes, I have great respect for nurses. And as many of you know, our Deputy Surgeon General, who I appointed close to 2 years ago, is a nurse, and we're incredibly proud of the work that she has done as our Deputy Surgeon General. But the point is that clinicians have a very important role that they now need to step up and play. And I say this recognizing that most of us were not taught about how to communicate with the public when we were in training. We weren't taught about how to do a media interview, how to speak to large groups, how to go out there and even speak to a member of Congress or a mayor or a local state legislator about what we see and the needs that we feel our patients have. But this is a skill that we have to absolutely develop. So as I think about what are the skills that we need to train 21st century clinicians in, it's not just in how to directly care for the patient in front of you, but it's also how to advocate for that patient with our leaders. It's how to communicate with the public about science so people understand the truth. And it's also about how to convene community leaders so that we can come together across sectors and fashion solutions to crises like the opioid epidemic.
Thank you. That really speaks to the totality of the need for coalitions, for ASAM as the voice of addiction medicine and the voice of evidence-based care to make our expertise known in the communities. And how it's not simply about the doctor and the patient, it's about the totality of the community involved. You, in your report, you dedicated an entire chapter to the healthcare system, speaking about financing system, technology system, education workforce issues. Where do you see at this point, in terms of the larger healthcare system, some low-hanging fruit to be, some areas that we could have some relatively easy wins to try to improve access to quality care?
Well, that's a great question. And we did, in fact, have an entire chapter dedicated to health systems because we realized that for us to be able to address addiction as a country, we need not only individuals to be more informed, but we need our systems to work better. And for as many of you know, better than just about anyone in the country, our systems have been siloed for too long. We've looked at behavioral health as a whole other realm of medicine that's often treated in separate buildings by separate people. And primary care docs and other specialists in medicine tend not to know a whole lot about how to engage with or treat and sometimes even identify substance use disorders. So that gap is one that we have to close. I remember even when I was practicing medicine up in Boston, even at a well-resourced hospital, that for many of us, getting somebody connected to treatment for a substance use disorder was really challenging, and it occurred in a realm that was completely separate from us physically. And so we have to close that gap and make sure that our systems are more integrated. But look, in terms of low-hanging fruit versus things that will take a longer investment, one of the first things that we can do is just really reflect on and think about how we talk about addiction in our healthcare setting. As a young clinician in medical school, I remember that taking cues from how my attendings spoke about the patients who came into the ER with a substance use disorder. And I remember some of them referring to them as junkies. I remember that some of them were looked on or looked at really as folks who had done this to themselves and maybe didn't necessarily deserve our time or certainly our compassion or energy to the same extent that other patients did. And all of those cues, as a young medical student, I sort of took on and recognized that, hey, maybe this is their fault. Maybe we should be focusing on the folks who need our time more. And it took me some time to reverse that and to recognize that, hold on, this is actually not entirely a disease of choice. This is, in fact, a chronic illness that has a lot of the same features, in a sense, that other chronic illnesses do. So we can change how we talk about addiction and create a model for doing that can influence other clinicians around us. We can also understand the resources that we already have today in our communities so that we can connect patients to them. There are many clinicians I run across all across the country who do not know what resources exist in their community for substance use disorders. And sometimes there are a lack of resources. Sometimes there are actually a few resources that exist but that are underutilized because clinicians don't know what's out there and are connecting their patients to them. So we can start with that. How we think about and talk about addiction, helping our clinicians understand what resources exist. But there are clearly some longer-term challenges that we're going to have to address. The integration of behavioral health and traditional medical care is one that is complex. It's not simple to do, but it is absolutely essential. Another change that we have to make is in our accounting and budgeting. We know that that the benefits of treating substance use disorders, the benefits of preventing substance use disorders by investing in evidence-based programs, these benefits accrue across society, to the business sector, they accrue to the education sector, as well as to the healthcare sector. But if all we're looking at are the inputs and outputs financially at a sector level, then we're missing the value that's being generated when we invest in prevention and when we invest in treatment. And I've heard this concern many times from public health departments across the country who say that their departments are being looked at as a cost center, as a money sink, if you will, because people aren't recognizing the benefits that they're bringing, which are just accruing to the bottom line of other sectors. So we have a lot of work to do with integrating health systems, with changing how we think about the accounting so that we recognize the value of prevention and treatment. But again, this is why this is an effort that's important for us to sustain and for us to see this as a long-term game. We're seeing a lot of, it's in the headlines right now, but in 2 or 3 years, there may be another issue that takes over the headlines. But just because that happens, that doesn't mean that we can allow addiction to be forgotten about or pushed to the back burner. And what's going to keep it on the front burner, what's going to keep it as an issue that requires our continued focus and dedication and attention is, I believe, the voices of clinicians, the voices of all of you at ASAM.
Thank you so much. And one of the best ways that we can as a country start by addressing the issue of stigma really was a report coming from the United States Surgeon General on addictive disease.
I want to say, about that point, this unfortunate stigma that's around addiction is a very painful one, and it is hurtful for me to hear these stories from families like all across the country who talk about how that stigma not only affected their loved one who was living with a substance use disorder, but hurt them as well. And so the more we talk about our stories, the more we share our experiences with substance use disorders, the more we give other people permission to share the same. And what this really points to, at the end of the day, is that your work as addiction specialists, as healthcare providers, as public health leaders, your work is about more than ensuring that we can prevent and treat substance use disorders. Your role is actually about reminding our country about a fundamental value that we have to ensure that we live and live out each and every day. And it's a value that states that every life matters, a value that states that we are responsible for each other. The fact that there are people in our country who feel that their lives don't matter because they are suffering with addiction, the fact that there are people who feel that others look upon them as less than because they ran into difficulty with alcohol or with opioids, that means to me that we are not living out that value, that every life matters. And the people who can remind us of that value, can ensure that that's reflected in our thought, our words, and our actions, are in fact our clinicians, are all of you. So that's why I'm so glad to have all of you as partners in this effort. I'm so glad to be able to join you today. Sadly not in person, but I'm glad we were able to make this work. Because while there was information I wanted to share with you today about the report that we did and about the lessons we've learned on the road, most importantly, I wanted to thank you for the work that you have done for years, often in the shadows, I know, ensuring that people who are suffering with substance use disorders got the care that they needed. And I want to thank you also for continuing to be that voice going forward and committing to being on this journey, regardless of whether it's in the headlines or not. And with your dedication, with your passion, I'm confident that not only can we get people the care that they need, not only can we work hard to prevent substance use disorders in the first place, but we can also ensure that that fundamental value, that every life matters, is reflected in who we are, and that it strengthens our family, strengthens our community, and ultimately strengthens our country.
Thank you, Vice Admiral. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Goldsmith to finish our opening plenary today. And I just wanted to thank you again for lending your voice and leadership and the passion and strength of your voice to all of ours.
And thank you, Dr. Clark, for being up here and handling the questions. And thank you, Vice Admiral Murthy, for being with us on Skype today. We really appreciate your huge effort to still be here, and also your huge effort as Surgeon General and advancing addiction and public health. I have a couple of quick announcements to make. I wanted to let you know that Dr. Mason is doing another talk following the morning break. And I also want to remind you that Joseph Green is here doing a special session Saturday night at 8 o'clock. And he made the comment, I'm going to hang on to this if you need to get it. If you want to see more of Joseph's work, please visit his website, josephlms.com. And also you can follow him on social media. I'm going to hang on to this if you need to write it down. Thank you, all our speakers. It was wonderful.